Imagine flying through the black Pacific night in 1945, your bomber loaded with fuel and explosives, cruising toward what you believe is safety in the darkness. You are a Japanese pilot who has survived countless missions, and you trust the night like an old friend. The Americans cannot see you here, you think. Their fighters are blind when the sun goes down. You have flown this route dozens of times, always under the protective blanket of darkness, always returning home. But tonight is different. Tonight, something is watching you from the shadows, something impossible, something your commanders told you did not exist. You hear no engine. You see no silhouette against the stars. There is only silence, and then suddenly, without warning, the night explodes with tracer fire and your wingman's plane erupts into flames and spirals down into the ocean below. Before you can even process what happened, another plane vanishes in a ball of fire. Then another. Then yours. In just 80 minutes, 4 bombers disappear from the sky as if swallowed by an invisible demon. The few who survive to tell the tale speak of a ghost, a phantom hunter that struck from nowhere and vanished into nothing. They call it impossible. They call it a nightmare. But it was real, and it had a name. The P-61 Black Widow, the deadliest night fighter the world had ever seen. The story of this incredible night in the Pacific War is not just about one mission or one aircraft. It is about how technology, courage, and innovation came together to change the rules of aerial combat forever. It is about young American crews who volunteered to fly the most dangerous missions imaginable, hunting enemy bombers in total darkness over hostile territory. It is about Japanese pilots who suddenly found themselves prey instead of predators, unable to understand how their enemy could see them when they themselves were flying blind. And it is about 80 minutes that proved beyond any doubt that the night no longer belonged to Japan, that a new era of warfare had arrived, and that nowhere in the sky was safe anymore. In the early years of World War II in the Pacific, the Japanese military dominated the night sky with confidence that bordered on arrogance. Their pilots flew bombing missions after sunset, attacking Allied positions, supply lines, and airfields with relative impunity, because they knew the Americans had no effective way to stop them. Night fighting was extremely difficult with the technology available in the early 1940s. Pilots could not see enemy aircraft in the darkness, and trying to intercept bombers at night was like trying to catch shadows with your bare hands. The Japanese took full advantage of this weakness, scheduling their most important bombing runs for after dark when they believed themselves untouchable. American commanders watched helplessly as Japanese bombers struck again and again under cover of darkness, destroying valuable aircraft on the ground, hitting supply depots, and killing soldiers who had no warning of the attacks coming from above. Traditional day fighters like the P-38 Lightning and F-4U Corsair were excellent aircraft, but they were nearly useless at night. Pilots reported that even when they knew enemy bombers were nearby, they simply could not see them against the black sky. A few experimental night interceptions were attempted using searchlights and basic radar, but these proved ineffective and dangerous. The Americans desperately needed a solution, a way to take back the night from Japan and turn the hunter into the hunted. The problem was not just about seeing in the dark. It was about everything that came with night operations. Navigation became treacherous without visual landmarks. Takeoffs and landings were dangerous without proper lighting. Communication was harder. Formation flying was nearly impossible. And even if a pilot somehow spotted an enemy plane, getting into position for a kill shot required skills and technology that simply did not exist yet. The Japanese knew all of this, and they exploited it ruthlessly. Their pilots grew comfortable with night missions, so comfortable that they began to believe the darkness made them invincible. This confidence would prove to be their undoing. While Japanese bombers ruled the night skies over the Pacific, American engineers and military planners were working frantically on a solution that would change everything. The concept was ambitious and had never been successfully implemented before. Create a dedicated night fighter aircraft equipped with onboard radar that could detect, track, and destroy enemy planes in total darkness. This was not about adapting existing day fighters for night work. This was about designing an entirely new aircraft from the ground up specifically for hunting in the dark. The project was given to Northrop Aircraft, and the result would be designated the P-61 Black Widow, the first American aircraft designed from its initial concept as a night fighter. The P-61 was unlike anything American forces had fielded before. It was massive for a fighter, with twin engines and a crew of 3 including a pilot, a radar operator, and a gunner. The aircraft was painted entirely in glossy black paint to make it nearly invisible at night, which gave it the menacing Black Widow name. But the real innovation was hidden inside. The plane carried the SCR-720 airborne intercept radar in its nose, a technological marvel that could detect enemy aircraft from several miles away in complete darkness. The radar operator sat in a separate compartment behind the pilot, staring at a circular scope that displayed blips representing enemy aircraft. He would guide the pilot toward the target using voice commands, bringing the Black Widow into perfect position for a kill. The armament was equally impressive. The P-61 bristled with 4 20mm cannons mounted in the belly, and on most models, a remote-controlled turret on top with 450 caliber machine guns. This combination gave the Black Widow devastating firepower that could shred an enemy bomber in seconds. The aircraft also had excellent handling characteristics for its size, with good maneuverability and the ability to fly slowly when stalking prey without stalling. Everything about the design was purpose-built for the night fighting mission, but building the aircraft was only half the battle. The crews who would fly it needed training that was completely different from anything other fighter pilots experienced. The men selected to fly the P-61 Black Widow were volunteers who understood they were signing up for one of the most dangerous jobs in the Army Air Forces. Night fighting required a special kind of courage because pilots would be flying in complete darkness, often in bad weather, navigating by instruments alone, taking off and landing on dimly lit runways, and hunting enemy aircraft that were trying just as hard to remain invisible. The training program was intense and comprehensive, lasting many months and covering everything from radar operation to night navigation to low-light gunnery techniques. Many pilots washed out of the program, unable to handle the unique demands of flying and fighting in the dark. The relationship between the pilot and radar operator was crucial to success. Unlike day fighters where the pilot relied on his eyes, the P-61 pilot was often flying blind, trusting completely in the radar operator's instructions. The radar operator would watch his scope, identify a target, and then give the pilot directions to intercept. He would say things like target at 2 o'clock, 5 miles, same altitude, turn right 10 degrees, and the pilot would follow these instructions precisely, bringing the invisible enemy closer and closer. Only when the target was very close, sometimes just a few hundred feet away, would the pilot be able to see the faint silhouette of the enemy aircraft and open fire. This required perfect coordination and absolute trust between crew members. Training accidents were common and deadly. Flying at night was inherently dangerous even without combat involved. Pilots misjudged altitudes and crashed into mountains or the ocean. Mid-air collisions happened when crews lost situational awareness. Equipment failures that would be manageable during daylight became catastrophic at night. But the volunteers kept coming because they understood how important the mission was. Every Japanese bomber that got through at night could kill dozens of American soldiers on the ground. Every successful night interception saved lives and brought the war closer to its end. The crews trained relentlessly, practicing intercepts over and over until the coordination between pilot and radar operator became instinctive and smooth. The first P-61 Black Widows arrived in the Pacific Theater in mid-1944, and their presence was kept as secret as possible. American commanders did not want the Japanese to know about this new capability until it was too late for them to adapt. The Black Widow units were stationed on islands that had been recently captured, operating from rough airstrips carved out of jungles and coral. The conditions were difficult, with intense heat, high humidity, tropical diseases, and frequent Japanese attacks. Maintenance crews worked around the clock to keep the complex radar systems functioning in an environment that was hostile to sensitive electronics. Every mission required careful preparation and multiple equipment checks because a radar failure at night could mean the difference between life and death. The first combat missions were cautious and experimental. Pilots and commanders were still learning how to employ this new weapon effectively. What were the best altitudes for patrols? How long should a Black Widow stay on station? What were the most likely routes for Japanese bombers? How could ground controllers guide the P-61s toward targets most efficiently? All of these questions had to be answered through trial and error, and some of the early missions came back empty-handed. But gradually, the night fighter crews developed tactics and procedures that worked. They learned to position themselves along known enemy approach routes. They learned the optimal radar search patterns. They learned how to distinguish between friendly and enemy returns on the radar scope, and then the kills started coming. A Japanese bomber shot down here, another there. The enemy began to notice that their previously safe night missions were becoming dangerous, but they did not understand why. Japanese pilots reported being attacked by unseen aircraft, but their commanders often dismissed these reports as confusion or exaggeration. The Americans kept the Black Widow operations quiet, not publicizing the victories, letting the Japanese remain in the dark about what was hunting them. This psychological aspect was important because it meant Japanese bomber crews continued flying the same routes and using the same tactics, not knowing they needed to change everything about their night operations. By early 1945, the war in the Pacific had reached a critical phase. American forces were closing in on the Japanese home islands, capturing strategic positions and tightening the noose. The Japanese were desperate, throwing everything they had into the fight, including increased night bombing missions against American positions. They needed to disrupt American supply lines, damage airfields, and slow the advance by any means possible. Night bombing was still considered one of their most effective tactics because they continued to believe that the darkness gave them an advantage. They had heard rumors of American night fighters and had lost a few bombers here and there, but they did not grasp the full extent of the threat they faced. One particular night fighter squadron operating in the Pacific had become exceptionally skilled at hunting Japanese bombers. The crews had flown dozens of missions together, and their coordination was flawless. The radar operators could read their scopes like experts, identifying targets at maximum range and guiding their pilots with precision. The pilots had learned to trust their instruments completely, flying smoothly through the blackest nights without vertigo or disorientation. The gunners knew their weapons intimately and could clear jams and malfunctions by feel alone. This squadron had racked up an impressive number of kills, but they were about to have a night that would go down in history. Intelligence reports indicated that the Japanese were planning a major night bombing effort against American installations. Multiple bomber groups would be flying in from different directions, attempting to overwhelm defenses and cause maximum damage. The Americans prepared carefully, positioning several Black Widows at optimal altitudes and locations to intercept the incoming raid. Ground controllers were ready with radar tracking information. All aircraft were fully armed and fueled. The maintenance crews had checked every system twice. As darkness fell, the P-61s took off one by one, their black shapes disappearing into the night sky like ghosts, climbing to patrol altitude and beginning their deadly vigil. The Japanese bombers were coming, and the Black Widows were waiting. The radar operator's voice crackled over the intercom with the words every P-61 crew wanted to hear: contact. He had picked up a return on his scope, a blip moving steadily across the display at the altitude and speed consistent with a Japanese bomber. The range was approximately 8 miles, too far for visual identification, but close enough to begin the intercept. The pilot acknowledged calmly and began a gentle turn to the heading the radar operator provided. This was the moment when training and experience came together, when hours of practice intercepts became the real thing with real lives hanging in the balance. The Black Widow closed the distance smoothly, the pilot flying by instruments while the radar operator called out continuous updates. 6 miles, 5 miles, 4 miles. The target was holding a steady course, apparently unaware it was being stalked. The bomber crew probably felt safe in the darkness, trusting the night to hide them as it always had before. They had no idea that invisible radio waves were bouncing off their aircraft and returning to a sophisticated receiver that was tracking their every move. They had no idea that a hunter was closing in from behind, guided by technology they did not know existed. At 2 miles, the pilot began straining his eyes forward, searching the darkness for any hint of the enemy. The radar operator confirmed the target was dead ahead, same altitude range closing. 1 mile, still nothing visible. Half a mile. And then suddenly there it was, a faint shape, slightly darker than the surrounding night, the unmistakable silhouette of a Japanese bomber. The pilot's heart rate increased as he maneuvered into the perfect attack position, slightly below and behind the target. The bomber crew still had no idea they were being hunted. The pilot armed his weapons, checked his sight, and moved his thumb over the firing button. At 300 feet, he opened fire. The 420mm cannons roared to life, sending a stream of explosive shells directly into the Japanese bomber's fuselage and wing. Tracer rounds lit up the night like deadly fireworks, and the pilot could see his rounds impacting, tearing through aluminum skin and vital components. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The bomber shuddered as the shells ripped through it, and within seconds, flames erupted from one of the engines. The fire spread rapidly, fed by fuel lines and hydraulic fluid, turning the aircraft into a flying torch. The bomber began to lose altitude, trailing flames and smoke, its crew desperately trying to maintain control but fighting a losing battle against the damage. The P-61 pilot pulled up and away, watching as the Japanese bomber continued its death spiral downward. There was no parachute visible, no sign that the crew had managed to escape. The burning aircraft fell faster and faster, the flames growing brighter against the black ocean below, until finally it impacted the water in a flash of light and then vanished, leaving only darkness behind. The entire engagement from first shot to impact had lasted less than 30 seconds. The radar operator confirmed the target was no longer on his scope. The pilot called in the kill to ground control, his voice professional and calm despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. But there was no time to celebrate. The radar operator already had another contact. The efficiency of the kill was remarkable and terrifying. The Japanese bomber crew probably never saw what hit them. One moment they were flying a routine mission in the safety of darkness, and the next moment they were being torn apart by cannon fire from an enemy they could not see and did not know was there. This was the nightmare scenario Japanese pilots had been whispering about, the ghost in the darkness that struck without warning. But this was not a ghost. This was American technology and American courage combined into a weapon system that had shifted the balance of power in the night sky completely. The second target appeared on the radar scope just minutes after the first kill. This bomber was on a slightly different heading, perhaps part of the same overall mission, but approaching from another angle. The P-61 pilot and radar operator went through the intercept procedure again, this time with even more confidence because they had just proven their system worked perfectly. The coordination between the two men was seamless, with the radar operator providing constant updates and the pilot making smooth adjustments to maintain the optimal intercept course. The Black Widow was living up to its name, a silent predator moving through the night with deadly purpose. This intercept proceeded almost identically to the first. The range closed steadily as the unsuspecting Japanese bomber continued on its course. At 3 miles, the pilot began his visual search. At 1 mile, he spotted the faint silhouette. He maneuvered into attack position with practiced precision, lined up his shot and opened fire. The cannons hammered out their deadly message, and once again, a Japanese bomber erupted in flames. This crew also had no chance to react or defend themselves. The first they knew of the attack was when their aircraft was already disintegrating around them. The bomber fell away trailing fire and smoke, disappearing into the ocean below just like the first. 2 kills in less than 20 minutes was an extraordinary achievement, but the P-61 crew was not finished. Their aircraft still had plenty of ammunition, their fuel situation was good, and the night was still young. Ground control was reporting additional contacts in the area, more Japanese bombers inbound to their targets, all of them flying blind into a trap they did not know existed. The radar operator kept his eyes locked on his scope, sweeping the airspace around them, searching for the next victim. The pilot maintained their patrol altitude and speed, ready to turn instantly toward any new target. The Black Widow was still hunting. The third contact came from a different direction, forcing the P-61 to maneuver more aggressively to set up the intercept. This bomber was at a slightly lower altitude and moving faster than the first two, perhaps a different aircraft type or a more experienced crew. But speed and altitude made no difference when the enemy could track you with radar. The Black Widow pilot rolled into a diving turn, losing altitude while increasing speed, bringing his aircraft onto an intercept course that would catch the Japanese bomber from behind and below. The radar operator worked his scope expertly, compensating for the changing geometry and providing updated guidance continuously. This intercept was more challenging because the closure rate was higher and the altitude difference required more careful management. The pilot had to avoid overshooting his target while also ensuring he maintained enough speed and energy for a second pass if needed. His instrument flying had to be perfect because any disorientation or mistake at night could be fatal. But the training took over, and his hands moved smoothly over the controls, making tiny adjustments based on the radar operator's instructions and his own feel for the aircraft. The Black Widow responded beautifully, tracking toward its target like a missile locked on course. When visual contact was made, the pilot found himself looking at a different type of Japanese bomber than the previous two, confirming that this was a coordinated multi-aircraft raid using different units. But the difference in aircraft type meant nothing. The P-61's cannons did not discriminate. The pilot positioned for the attack, waited until the range was optimal and fired. The result was the same as before: devastating hits, immediate fires, loss of control, and a burning aircraft falling into the ocean. 3 Japanese bombers destroyed in less than an hour. But the night was not over yet, and neither was the killing. Less than 10 minutes after the third kill, the radar operator picked up yet another contact. By this point, the P-61 crew was operating in a zone of complete focus and efficiency. There was no excitement, no panic, just professional competence executing a deadly mission with machine-like precision. The pilot turned toward the new heading provided by his radar operator, established the intercept course, and began closing the distance. This fourth bomber was the furthest away of all the contacts, requiring a longer chase, but the P-61 had the speed and endurance to run down its prey with ease. As the range decreased, ground control radioed to inform the Black Widow crew that they were aware of the multiple kills and that no other American aircraft were in the area. This was important information because it confirmed that any radar contact was definitely hostile and could be engaged without hesitation. The crew did not need the encouragement, but it was reassuring to know that their incredible success was being monitored and appreciated. They continued the intercept, eating up the miles between themselves and the unsuspecting Japanese bomber crew who had no idea they were about to become the fourth victim of the night. The final intercept played out with the same deadly efficiency as the previous 3. Visual contact was made at the expected range. The pilot maneuvered into perfect firing position. The cannons roared. The enemy bomber exploded into flames. Another crew died without ever seeing their killer. Another aircraft fell burning into the Pacific Ocean. And then, finally, the radar scope was clear. There were no more contacts in range. The mission was over. In just 80 minutes, a single P-61 Black Widow crew had shot down 4 Japanese bombers, dealing a devastating blow to the enemy's night bombing capability and proving beyond any doubt that the night sky was no longer a safe haven for Japan. When the P-61 crew landed back at their base after the mission, they were exhausted but exhilarated. They had just participated in one of the most successful night fighter missions of the entire war, and the ground crew who helped them out of their aircraft could see the excitement and satisfaction on their faces. The intelligence officers debriefed them immediately, recording every detail of the mission for analysis and documentation. The 4 kills were confirmed through multiple sources including ground radar tracking, radio intercepts, and the crew's own detailed accounts. There was no doubt about the success. 4 Japanese bombers had been destroyed in 80 minutes by a single night fighter, a feat that would have been considered impossible just a few years earlier. News of the mission spread quickly through the squadron, and then through the wider Army Air Forces community. Other P-61 crews were inspired by the achievement and pushed themselves to match it. Maintenance personnel worked even harder to keep the Black Widows in perfect condition, knowing that their efforts directly contributed to missions like this. Commanders began to appreciate just how valuable the night fighter capability had become and started planning more aggressive night operations. The psychological impact on American forces was significant because it demonstrated clear technological and tactical superiority over the enemy in a domain that had previously belonged to Japan. But the most significant aftermath was the effect on the Japanese. Word began to filter back through intelligence channels that Japanese bomber crews were reporting devastating losses on night missions, and that many pilots were terrified to fly after dark. The reports spoke of invisible attackers that struck without warning and vanished without a trace. Some Japanese pilots refused to fly night missions, claiming it was suicide. The Japanese military command was slow to understand what was happening because they had underestimated American technological development and did not believe the Americans could have developed such an effective night fighting capability. By the time they realized the truth, it was too late. The P-61 Black Widow and other Allied night fighters had already seized control of the night sky and were never going to give it back. The success of that 80-minute mission and countless other P-61 operations came down to one fundamental technological breakthrough: airborne radar. Before radar, night fighting was almost impossible because humans cannot see well enough in darkness to detect, track, and engage enemy aircraft. Radar changed everything by giving aircraft the ability to see with radio waves instead of light. The SCR-720 radar system used in the P-61 transmitted radio pulses that bounced off metal objects like aircraft and returned to the receiver. By measuring the time it took for the pulses to return, the system could calculate the distance to the target. By tracking how the return signal changed over time, the system could determine the target's heading and speed. Operating the radar required significant skill and training. The radar operator had to interpret the blips on his circular scope, distinguishing between real targets and false returns caused by ground clutter, weather, or equipment anomalies. He had to estimate the target's altitude and heading based on how the blip moved across the screen. He had to guide his pilot using only this information, translating what he saw on the scope into directional commands that would bring the Black Widow into attack position. The best radar operators developed an almost intuitive feel for their equipment, able to read the scope like an expert reads a book, seeing patterns and information that less experienced operators would miss. The radar also had limitations that crews had to understand and work around. Its effective range was only about 5 miles under good conditions and could be much less in bad weather, or if the target was at very low altitude where ground returns interfered with the signal. The radar could not identify what type of aircraft it was detecting, only that something was there. The scope was difficult to read and required the operator to work in near darkness to maintain his night vision. Equipment failures were common, especially in the harsh tropical environment of the Pacific Theater. But despite these limitations, The radar gave P-61 crews an enormous advantage over enemy aircraft that had no idea they were being tracked and no way to detect or evade the radar beams painting them. Technology alone did not make the P-61 successful. Behind every kill was a crew of highly trained, highly motivated young Americans who volunteered for one of the most dangerous jobs in the war. The pilot had to have exceptional instrument flying skills and the ability to maintain perfect control of his aircraft in total darkness, while simultaneously following his radar operator's instructions and searching for visual contact with the target. He had to be able to maneuver aggressively when needed, but also fly smoothly and precisely when stalking a target. He had to manage his emotions, staying calm under pressure and making split-second decisions that could mean the difference between success and failure. The radar operator carried enormous responsibility because the success of the entire mission depended on his ability to work his equipment effectively. He had to detect targets at maximum range, track them accurately, and guide his pilot into position without losing contact. He had to distinguish between multiple targets on his scope and prioritize which one to engage. He had to communicate clearly and concisely with his pilot, giving him the information he needed without overwhelming him with unnecessary details. He had to troubleshoot equipment problems on the fly and compensate for system limitations. The best radar operators were worth their weight in gold, and pilots trusted them with their lives. The gunner, when carried, was responsible for the remote turret and also served as an extra set of eyes scanning for enemy fighters that might try to attack the Black Widow. He monitored aircraft systems and provided updates on fuel and ammunition status. In some aircraft and missions, the gunner position was eliminated to save weight and extend range. But when present, the gunner was a vital part of the team. What made P-61 crews so effective was not just their individual skills, but how well they worked together as a unit. The best crews developed an almost telepathic coordination, anticipating each other's needs and actions, functioning as a single organism dedicated to hunting and killing enemy aircraft. The success of the P-61 and other Allied night fighters had a profound impact on Japanese military operations in the final year of the war. Japanese bomber units that had previously operated with relative freedom at night suddenly found themselves suffering catastrophic losses. Crews that survived night missions came back with terrifying stories of invisible attackers and comrades disappearing in flames without warning. The psychological impact was devastating because the Japanese pilots could not fight what they could not see. They felt helpless and vulnerable, knowing that death could come at any moment from any direction without warning. Japanese commanders tried various tactics to counter the night fighter threat. They attempted to fly at different altitudes, hoping to avoid the patrol zones where American night fighters operated. They tried flying at very low altitude to hide in ground clutter, but this was extremely dangerous and resulted in many crashes. They experimented with different routes and timing, trying to find patterns that would avoid the Black Widows. They even tried flying without lights or using decoy aircraft, but nothing worked consistently. The fundamental problem was that radar could detect them regardless of what evasive measures they took, and without their own airborne radar, they had no way to detect the night fighters before it was too late. The losses became so severe that some Japanese units essentially stopped flying night missions altogether, ceding the darkness to the Americans without a fight. This had significant strategic implications because it meant the Americans could move supplies and personnel at night without fear of air attack. It meant American airfields were safe after dark. It meant the Japanese lost one of their few remaining offensive capabilities. The P-61 and other night fighters did not win the war single-handedly, but they contributed to the inexorable pressure that was crushing Japanese military power and bringing the conflict closer to its end. The P-61 Black Widow served with distinction throughout the remainder of World War II and into the early post-war period. The aircraft and its crews compiled an impressive combat record, shooting down hundreds of enemy aircraft in both the Pacific and European theaters. The 4 kills in 80 minutes was one of the most spectacular single-mission achievements, but many P-61 crews had multiple victories and proved the concept of radar-equipped night fighters conclusively. The lessons learned from Black Widow operations influenced post-war fighter design and led directly to the development of more advanced night and all-weather fighters in the jet age. The Black Widow was not perfect. It was large and relatively slow compared to day fighters, making it vulnerable if caught by enemy fighters in daylight. The radar system was complex and unreliable by modern standards, requiring constant maintenance and frequent repairs. The aircraft was expensive to build and operate compared to simpler day fighters, but for its intended mission of night interception, the P-61 was superb and had no real competition during its operational period. It gave American forces a capability that the enemy could not match and demonstrated the value of investing in advanced technology, even when that technology was unproven and risky. Perhaps the most important legacy of the Black Widow was the proof that air superiority could be extended into the night through technology and training. Before the P-61, nighttime was a defensive period when aircraft stayed on the ground, and everyone hoped enemy bombers would not find their targets in the darkness. After the P-61, night became just another time to conduct offensive operations, to hunt enemy aircraft, to maintain pressure on the enemy around the clock. This concept of 24-hour air operations became fundamental to modern air warfare and remains so to this day. Every modern fighter with radar and night vision capability traces its lineage back to pioneers like the P-61 Black Widow. The true heroes of the Black Widow story were the young men who climbed into those black-painted aircraft night after night, knowing they were flying into danger with only their training and technology to protect them. Many of them were barely out of their teens, farm boys and city kids who had volunteered to serve their country and ended up in one of the most specialized and dangerous roles in the Army Air Forces. They learned to trust their instruments when every human instinct screamed at them that they were disoriented. They learned to remain calm when their aircraft was being tossed around by storms in complete darkness. They learned to kill enemy airmen efficiently and professionally without losing their humanity. Some of these crews did not survive. Night fighting was inherently dangerous, and accidents claimed lives even when the enemy did not. Pilots crashed into mountains while navigating in bad weather. Aircraft collided in the darkness. Mechanical failures occurred at the worst possible moments. Enemy fighters occasionally caught P-61s during daylight hours and shot them down. The cost of developing and employing night fighter capability was paid in blood by brave young Americans who understood the risks and flew anyway, because the mission was too important to abandon. The survivors carried their experiences for the rest of their lives. Many stayed in aviation after the war, becoming commercial pilots or remaining in the military, as the Army Air Forces became the independent United States Air Force. They formed veteran associations and stayed in touch with their crewmates, maintaining bonds that had been forged in the darkness over hostile territory. They told their stories to younger generations, ensuring that the sacrifices and achievements of the night fighter community would not be forgotten. And when they heard the sound of aircraft engines at night, they remembered what it was like to hunt in the darkness, to strike without warning, to be the ghost that terrified the enemy. The mission where 4 Japanese bombers disappeared in 80 minutes was not just a tactical success, but a strategic turning point that symbolized the shift in technological and operational advantage to the Allied side. It demonstrated that American industry could develop advanced weapon systems and deploy them effectively in combat. It proved that American training programs could produce crews capable of operating complex equipment under the most demanding conditions. It showed that American tactical thinking had evolved beyond simply copying what others did to genuinely innovative approaches that gave decisive advantages. For the Japanese bomber crews who died that night, there was no chance to learn from the experience or adapt to the threat. They were victims of a technological revolution they did not see coming and could not counter once it arrived. Their deaths were not meaningless, but they were inevitable given the vast disparity in industrial capacity and technological development between Japan and the United States by 1945. The same story was playing out across every domain of warfare, from aircraft carriers to submarines to radar to code breaking. Japan had started the war with qualitative advantages in some areas, but the United States had caught up and surpassed them across the board. That night of perfect execution, where a single P-61 crew destroyed 4 enemy bombers in rapid succession, became legendary within the night fighter community and remained a benchmark of excellence for decades. Pilots and radar operators studied the mission, trying to understand exactly how the crew achieved such remarkable success. Was it perfect radar operation, exceptional pilot skill, luck? The truth was probably a combination of all three plus the accumulated experience of months of combat operations. The crew was at the peak of their abilities, their equipment was functioning perfectly, and the enemy was cooperative by flying predictably into a well-planned trap. Everything came together for 80 minutes of near-perfect aerial combat. As the war moved into its final months in 1945, P-61 Black Widows and other Allied night fighters completely dominated the night skies over the Pacific and Europe. Japanese and German night bombing efforts had been effectively shut down, and the Allies used the night hours to move forces and supplies without interference. The psychological impact on enemy forces was significant because they knew that nowhere was safe anymore, that American aircraft could strike at any time, day or night, with precision and devastating effect. The 24-hour pressure contributed to the collapse of enemy morale and the eventual surrender of both Germany and Japan. The final combat missions flown by P-61s occurred in the weeks before Japan's surrender in August 1945. By this time, Japanese air opposition had been largely destroyed, and the Black Widows found fewer and fewer targets on their patrols. Some missions were flown in support of the atomic bomb attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, providing night cover for the bombers and reconnaissance aircraft involved in those operations. When the war finally ended, P-61 crews felt a mixture of relief and satisfaction. They had done their job superbly, had contributed significantly to victory, and had survived one of the most dangerous specialties in military aviation. The post-war period saw rapid development of jet aircraft and more advanced radar systems that made the P-61 obsolete within just a few years. The Black Widow was retired from frontline service and replaced by jet-powered night fighters that were faster, more capable, and more reliable. But the fundamental concept pioneered by the P-61, the idea of a radar-equipped night fighter as an essential component of air defense, remained central to military aviation. Every nation that could afford to do so developed night and all-weather fighters, and the technology continued to evolve until modern fighters can operate effectively in any conditions at any time with capabilities that would seem like science fiction to the P-61 crews. Today, very few P-61 Black Widows survive. The aircraft were scrapped en masse after the war, their complex systems stripped for parts, and their airframes cut up for aluminum. Only a handful were saved for museums, and even fewer remain in anything approaching complete condition. Aviation enthusiasts and historians have worked to preserve these rare survivors and to document the history of the aircraft and the men who flew it. The Black Widow remains a favorite subject for model builders and aviation artists, who are drawn to its unique appearance and dramatic mission profile. The story of the 80-minute hunt that claimed 4 Japanese bombers has been documented in official histories and veteran memoirs, though the details sometimes vary depending on the source. The core facts remain undisputed. A single P-61 crew achieved a remarkable success rate on one night in 1945, demonstrating the effectiveness of night fighter tactics and technology in the most dramatic way possible. The mission has been studied by military historians and aviation tacticians as an example of perfect execution and effective use of advanced technology to achieve air superiority. Veterans of the P-61 program are now nearly all gone, claimed by time as they could not be claimed by enemy fire. Their stories live on through written accounts, recorded interviews, and the efforts of historians to preserve the memory of their service. When we look at modern stealth fighters with advanced radar and night vision systems, we should remember that the foundation for those capabilities was laid by young Americans flying black-painted aircraft through the dangerous night skies of World War II, hunting an enemy that could not see them coming and learning lessons that would shape military aviation for generations to come. The lessons learned from that 80-minute period of perfect night fighting continue to resonate through modern military aviation. The importance of crew coordination, the value of superior technology, the advantage of surprise, the effectiveness of well-planned tactics executed with precision. All of these principles demonstrated that night remained fundamental to air combat today. Modern fighter crews train extensively in night operations and all-weather fighting, understanding that air superiority must be maintained around the clock and in all conditions if it is to be meaningful. The technological lineage from the P-61's SCR-720 radar to modern AESA radar systems is clear and direct. Each generation of radar has been more powerful, more accurate, more reliable, and more capable than the last, but the fundamental principle of using radio waves to detect and track targets remains unchanged. The same is true for night vision technology, heads-up displays, and data fusion systems that combine information from multiple sensors to give pilots unprecedented situational awareness. All of these systems trace their origins back to the pioneering work done on aircraft like the Black Widow. Perhaps most importantly, the story of the P-61 and that incredible 80-minute hunt reminds us of the human element in warfare. Technology creates possibilities, but people achieve victories. The radar was useless without a skilled operator to interpret its signals. The aircraft was useless without a trained pilot to fly it. The weapons were useless without a crew disciplined enough to close within range and accurate enough to hit the target. The success of the Black Widow program was ultimately about the young Americans who volunteered to fly the aircraft, who trained until their skills were razor sharp, who flew into the night again and again despite the dangers, and who proved that courage combined with technology can achieve what seems impossible. The story of how 4 Japanese bombers disappeared in 80 minutes is more than just an account of one successful mission. It is the story of how warfare changed forever, how technology shifted the balance of power, and how young Americans rose to meet an extraordinary challenge with skill and courage. Those Japanese crews who died that night were not cowards or incompetents. They were experienced pilots flying what they believed were safe missions using tactics that had worked countless times before. But the world had changed beneath them, and the darkness that had once protected them had become their enemy. The P-61 Black Widow represented a revolution in aerial warfare as significant as the introduction of the machine gun or the jet engine. It demonstrated that night was no longer a sanctuary, that technology could extend human senses beyond their natural limits, and that military forces that failed to innovate and adapt would be swept away by those that did. The 80 minutes that saw 4 bombers fall from the sky were the culmination of years of research, development, training, and combat experience. They were a moment of perfect execution that proved the value of everything the night fighter program had been trying to achieve. For the Japanese military, that night and others like it represented a crushing blow to their capabilities and morale. Their pilots had believed in the safety of darkness, and that belief was shattered by invisible hunters who struck without warning. The psychological impact was as important as the physical losses because it meant Japanese crews knew they were vulnerable everywhere at all times. There was no safe haven left. The Americans could reach them day or night, in good weather or bad, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. The young Americans who flew the Black Widow earned their place in history through missions like the one that saw 4 bombers fall in 80 minutes. They volunteered for dangerous duty and executed it with professional excellence. They mastered complex technology and employed it effectively in combat. They maintained their discipline and focus under conditions that would break lesser men, and they achieved results that contributed materially to winning the war and bringing their comrades home. The story of their achievements deserves to be remembered and honored as an example of what Americans can accomplish when they combine courage, skill, and innovation in service of their country. The ghost in the darkness was real, and it had a name. It was called the Black Widow, and for a brief moment in history, it ruled the night sky with devastating effectiveness. 4 bombers in 80 minutes. 4 crews who never knew what killed them. 1 American crew who executed their mission perfectly. This is their story, and it will never be forgotten as long as there are people who understand that freedom must be defended by those willing to fly into the darkness and face whatever awaits them there.